Thank you and welcome everyone to this Mosaic Alive, a visual public program from Mosaic Theater. It's great to have this, we're going to be having this conversation on the Emmett Till trilogy, and we are excited to have with us three really powerful folks to talk about the issue of Emmett Till, the power of art and activism. I want to begin by introducing Lonnie Bunch. He's the 14th Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, recently appointed, and of course was the founding director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. We also have the playwright Ifa Bayeza, who wrote the trilogy, and she'll be talking a lot about that trilogy, what inspired her to write it, and what is the impact of art on our culture and our politics and everything else that we do here in the United States. And of course, we have Sheldon Scott. Sheldon is an artist and he's the director of culture at the Eaton Hotel here in Washington, D.C. I'd like to welcome all three of you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I want to begin with you, Lonnie. I know that you are, of course, the founding director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, as I mentioned. And obviously, you know, the word culture is in the name of that museum, and in the Smithsonian, of course, that's also an important word. Also, I'm always kind of at odds at why this country does not have a Ministry of Culture. Many developed countries have those ministries. We don't. The Smithsonian tends to play that role. Can you speak a little bit about the role of culture in our society?
I think it's important when I think about my career as a historian. The most important thing for me is that history became my tool, my weapon for the struggle for social justice. And I began to realize that if I could use history to contextualize, to engage, to get people to understand what America is and what it could be, that could lead to transformation. But I must be honest, what has really shaped me was something that happened more than 20 years ago. 20 years ago, Studs Terkel, the great oral historian, introduced me to Emmett Till's mother, Mamie Till Mobley, and we became fast friends. And at one point, I was at her house, and she was talking about how important it was that for 50 years she carried the burden of Emmett Till, and now it was someone else's turn. And I felt I needed to take on that mantle. So as I began to sort of build the new museum at the Smithsonian and now take on this position as secretary, I realized that my job in part is to help a country remember people like Emmett Till, remember what it needs to remember, not just what it wants to remember. So for me, the Smithsonian really is the de facto Ministry of Culture. And what I do is take very seriously the notion of how do we support culture around the country, but also how do we reflect America globally? So for me, the Smithsonian is really a place that you come to touch the past, to understand about dinosaurs, to look at aviation, to be amazed by the beauty of the art. But more importantly, you come to understand who you are and who you can become.
Beautiful. Eva, I wanted to ask you sort of the same question. You chose art to showcase an important element of American history and to hopefully move that dialogue forward. How did you get into this field? What prompted you to want to do this story about Emmett Till?
Well, that's two different questions. Getting into the field, I was writing plays since I was 12, actually. So I came from a very kind of activist and creative household. It was part of our upbringing that was instilled in all of my three siblings and myself by my parents and even our grandparents, the importance of activism and advocacy on behalf of Black people. And from our the very earliest upbringing, and my parents were kind of Du Boisian in the sense that they felt as individuals of achievement and who had access. My father was a physician, my mother a social worker. They felt it was part of their responsibility to create access and to advocate for other Black people. And from our earliest beginnings, that was that instilled. They had an expression. They said, well, you may never be a servant, but you must always serve your people. And all of their children, myself included, in whatever profession we've chosen. My sister is a diplomat. My brother is an attorney and entrepreneur, and my older sister, Angela Chande, world-renowned poet and writer. So in my case, I chose theater as a way of being a public thinker. And just as Lonnie was saying, using the history as almost my medium. The Till Trilogy is certainly one of my definitive works, but my other plays also deal with essential historic moments in the saga of African American people, not only in the making of our culture, but in the making of the New World. So, and I came by the trilogy kind of in an odd way. I was called to it more than my initiating the project. I was working on another, this was back in the late 80s and the early 90s. I was working on a saga called Homer G and the Rhapsodies in the Fall of Detroit, where I was trying to examine and challenge the high incidence of mortality and homicide among young Black men and boys at the height of the crack epidemic. And one of the characters, a father who had just lost his son, it came to me in kind of a revelation that he had been a witness to the murder of Emmett Till and had not come forward. So I took myself to the library thinking I was going to do some research for this fictional piece I was working on. And as soon as I became engrossed in the research, I realized that this story of Emmett Till was what was compelling me. And the call to bear witness was not to this fictional character, but to me.
Wonderful. Thank you. Sheldon, I want to go to you, and I know that you're an artist and you're an activist as well. What do you feel is the role of art in activism? How important is that? I know that you're the director of culture at a well-known hotel institution here in Washington, D.C. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I felt historically, art has always been a conduit or delivery system for some of the most important activists and human rights messaging historically. And like oftentimes when society needs to be moved or shifted or exposed, I think the most reliable institution for that is the artistic and creative expression. We learn more about ourselves through music, arts, through song, through plays. Um, we learn more about ourselves through that way because it's an easier reflection to process. I think sometimes like we really make the assumption that, the institution of journalism, has this role that expands beyond just the delivery of information. And sometimes I think we fail in that space. I think journalism has a particular role, academia has a particular role, and the restorative part of the history. But I think when it comes to the process of self-reflection, art is the probably most important way to do that because it's where we as human beings get to kind of express or stress our empathetic muscle in sometimes ways that don't feel so convicting of ourselves. Like, we are very ego motivated species, and sometimes it's hard for us to hear the things about ourselves. And art has a way of creating a pathway, of building a bridge between that, which then will ultimately leave the institution of action or activism, where people actually start to respond and change the way that they exist in the world based on the new information that they have. And my work as a visual artist, as a storyteller, has always been, centered around reaching back to these restorative histories, and I bring into that a little bit of my um, first profession as a psychotherapist, and using art as a way to allow people to access their own um, psychological landscape as it relates to one issue or another. And I think that when you look at some of the most beautiful but graphic and challenging expressions, what art does there is really create that opportunity for growth and then the passing on to the other process. So, that's been a part of my practice as an artist, but then also it's a lot of what I bring into the work that I do at Eaton as the director of culture, because, it's also important to remind people that these movements, the civil rights movements, are not a finite process. They're continuums, and we still every day have to remember to fight. And sometimes that fight looks a lot different than the fight has historically. I think we look at civil rights movement as a very particular way in a very particular time, but it is very clear that those things are still happening. And sometimes it's easier for us to see what's happening now by looking back.
Thank you. Lonnie, I wanted to ask you about the museum, the African American Museum. And I wanted to ask you specifically about how how important is it to showcase a person, a hero, a shiro, a person who becomes the focal point for a point that you want to make, let's say in the museum. The idea that the life of Emmett Till, for instance, for a lot of people sparked the civil rights movement. I mean, that was kind of a pivotal moment of the civil rights movement. And I know that you guys obtained the casket, right? For it's an incredible um, showcase that you have there that tells the story of that, but it weaves into it the kind of the forward moving thinking of the civil rights movement after that. Can you speak a little bit about the importance of having these particular narratives, these particular stories showcased to move the dialogue forward?
Well, I think that first of all, part of my job is to give voice to the anonymous and to make visible those that have been left out of history. So I think part of the job is to say, I want you to understand Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth, but I want you to understand people whose names you don't know, who were famous only to their family. And I have to be honest, when I sat down with Mamie in my office, I was then the president of the Chicago Historic Society. We were going to have lunch. She spoke for 7 hours about what happened to her child from the time she kissed him to the time she buried him. And I was a puddle of tears. I couldn't believe the candor which she shared this. And we spent a lot of time together. And so I kept hearing her words after she died in my head saying, you've got to carry the burden of remembering Emmett Till. And also, as an African American male of a certain age, I didn't know Emmett Till's name, but I knew the story. Anybody who was Black who lived in the North and had Southern relatives were told the story of a Black child that ran afoul of racism and was brutally murdered in the South. So you knew that as a cautionary tale. So I didn't know it was Emmett Till, but I knew that it happened to somebody who looked just like me. When we were opening the museum, the Till family asked me, they said, when the FBI looked at reopening the case, they disinterred Emmett. He was buried in a new casket, and the original casket was supposed to be taken care of. And a long story short, it was put in a shed, not protected. And the family asked me, would I do something? And I have to be honest. I thought, do I want a casket? Is that ghoulish? But I kept hearing Mamie saying, this is the story you have to tell. So I initially agreed just to take the casket and preserve it. Wasn't sure I'd ever display it. And then as I was thinking about crafting the museum, I realized that one of the most sacred spaces in that museum could tell the story of Emmett Till. And so what we decided to do was to take the casket, recreate the church service where he was buried, but also frame it through the story of his mother, to suggest that the broken body is horrible, But here is a woman at the worst moment in her life who took that and said, I will transform myself. I will help transform the civil rights movement. And so for me, before I became secretary of the Smithsonian, every day before I began work, I would walk into the exhibit on Emmett Till and sort of think about him, think about Mamie, and that would give me the strength to carry on as well.
Wow.
It is a sacred space. And I remember the day I came in to tell you that I had decided to transform the first play, The Ballad of Emmett Till, into a trilogy, was the day that you were negotiating to bring the casket to Washington. I don't know if you remember, just a casual meeting that by serendipity wound up being not casual at all, because even that moment was filled with the spirit of that story. And it is a sacred space. It is a hallowed ground when you walk into the museum. And that has that same energy as the original funeral, allowing scores of people to experience that moment of grief as resistance and the forging of what one individual family and individual life, how it can inspire so many others.
Well, I want to stick with that point, Eva, for a moment, because this is a life that made a huge impact on society and changed many things from that day forward. We have seen Black Lives Matter, of course, movements like that now, spring up, but we've had so many deaths, so many Black boys and men have been killed. I mean, the names go on and on and on, and yet there does not seem to be that same kind of impact, that same kind of change that happened with the Emmett Till story. What makes a single moment? What makes a single moment so significant that it becomes a paradigm shift? What was special about that moment? Because there had been many young men that were lynched before then, that were killed by mobs. Didn't have an impact to the level that Emmett Till's situation had. Can you please speak a little bit about what made that moment so unique?
I think it was a confluence of things. The first being, as Lonnie was saying, Mamie Till Mobley's decision to have an open casket funeral. And that caused a spontaneous gathering of people to bear witness to all of those anonymous souls, men, women, boys, girls who had been assaulted, attacked, maimed, and killed, and disappeared in the American South. And it allowed people to bear witness to their own grief. And I had that experience in countless times when we were putting on the play, The Ballad of Emmett Till. It in post-play discussion, individual after individual would be able to come forward saying that this play gave them permission to give voice to an experience that they had not uttered to anyone else, their personal experience. And I think the combination of Mamie Till Mobley's valiance, turning from a single mother into a warrior mother who waged battle for, as Lonnie said, 50 years. And also it was, I think, the youthfulness of Emmett himself, and the fact that 1955 was barely a year after Brown versus the Board of Ed, which had at the center of the desegregation effort the lives and the role of children. And for those of us who were children of that era, it was again, as Lonnie said, a cautionary tale, but also an inspiring tale to discover the agency that youth had, our vulnerability on the one hand, but also the agency that we possessed. And you started to see in the coming years the number of young people, whether it was the college students who sat in at Woolworth's or the students at Fisk who trained in nonviolent resistance. Youth really took on or the Little Rock Nine. We were at the front lines of the beginning of the new modern civil rights movement.
I think what's important, I think what's so important what you're saying is that, first of all, remember, the reason why you personalize this is that he became the symbol of all those who were killed before, right? So instead of just saying there are thousands of Black men and women who were killed, you look at it through the lens of Emmett Till. And also what that allowed people to do is we also forget that what made that so powerful was we used the social media of the time, Jet Magazine. And
Right.
so suddenly you saw this in places where you never saw that. Instead of just saying, I've heard about it, suddenly there was that horrible picture of that broken body, which motivated people, moved people. But also I think that it also was crucial because it raised the issue that you raised, which is you realize that regardless of your age, you had a responsibility to change a country. So whether it was being involved in SNCC, whether it was being involved in other sit-ins, whatever it was, you found yourself saying, let us not forget Emmett Till. And from my vantage point, having a mother who actually stood up at the most painful moment of her life and said, you need to see what they did to my son. You need to understand what America is and what America could be. And so I find the story of Emmett Till so moving because it really captured everything. It gave us a focal point. It let us think about how to use the media in different ways. It allowed us to come together as young people to change a country. So for me, Emmett Till is part of a long trend of people who lost their lives to change a country. But Emmett's death allowed us to illuminate all the dark corners of that change. And that's why it's still such a powerful story.
Yeah.
And yet, if you think about it, the dark corners continued to fester in this country. Obviously, Black Lives Matter has shown us a lot of that. And I think the use of, as you mentioned, Lonnie, the social media of the time now is the iPhone. People have been filming these horrific deaths by police and by authorities oftentimes. And it seems like we've gotten numb to it at some level. You know, I mean, at some point, people get very motivated and very emotional and want to make the change that needs to happen. And then when you have one after another, after another, after another, people sort of tune out, it seems like. So is it we're seeing too much that it's become kind of like white noise almost, pardon the pun, but the idea of an individual is a huge issue, right? But when you have a lot of people that are, and it's constant and consistent and it's the same over and over again, people tend to be less motivated to make the change that needs to happen. So what's happening today that's preventing us from moving this to the next level?
I think some of it, Andy, like, you know, Ruth mentioned earlier, like the institution of journalism has a responsibility. And it was clearly demonstrated in the printing and publishing of the photos from Emmett's casket. Now, where we are right now, like Dr. Bunch mentioned, the social media age of the time, it brings a certain level of democratization to that process. We no longer have to rely on the institution to provide us with the information. But what that essentially does is like what you're talking about, it just opens up a floodgate because now all of these stories are inundating our timelines. And then what happens there is like, I think that that process is very effective. I think the democratization of that, getting the information out, like we saw it maybe for the first time in that form around the Rodney King beating. So there was definitely a response there. And then since these mobile devices now have basically activated everyone's hand in that way, but what we have to do is like realize that it doesn't stop there. Like there's a responsibility now with the information out there. And this is where like the conduit or the delivery system of art becomes even more important, because now we have to help people to process like the tonnage of information now that now exists. And stories, particularly for people of color, Black people, we knew this was happening already. We didn't have to rely on Facebook or Instagram to tell us the things that we already knew. Because like Lonnie mentioned, like these cautionary tales have always been shared with us. But now where we are right now is like, what do we do with the information? What do we do with the story of Trayvon Martin? And I think what we have to realize is like, it doesn't stop there. Like, you know, Emmett Till happened in 1955. We are still very much in the throes of processing what that is.
Yeah.
2 generations later. And we're still not finished yet. And this is why work like the Ballad of Emmett Till are so critical and important even at this time. There's a lot more to do.
So I want to turn, that's an excellent point, Sheldon. I want to turn to Aoife for a moment. You worry that you're telling something in history that people will say, oh, that was then, and it's no longer that today?
No. You know, I've got to subject the work to an audience, and then I see what happens. That what I try to do as someone who works.
How do you make it relevant
Well,
to now for the person that walks into the theater says, this is still going on today?
I think hopefully through the quality of my art, I have to subject it to, that's the test. Does it, will an audience find resonance in the work? And what I found is that, particularly for young audience members, it's almost like a twofold response. One, seeing the fullness of a character, the fullness of a life being or live trade, lets them see and feel history in a visceral way, and to identify their present realities with an historic past. It's a continuum, if you will. And they make that connection themselves, say, this is happening right now. And they take the energy and the knowledge of the movement that was sparked through Till, and begin to apply it to their own lives with a new sense of urgency, and again a sense of their own potential agency. And there's also in that creation of this continuum of history, an outrage, if you will, that fuels a commitment. People leave the theater with a sense of a commitment to be active in the struggle in our own time.
I think that's so powerful what you just said, because I think all of you have said, for me, what is so powerful has been the marriage of history, culture, and art. It seems to me that part of what art does is it personalizes it, it makes it concrete, but also it's also part of a way to use history and make it accessible and allow people to understand the relevance. You know, I think as a historian, when I created the African American Museum, the most important thing I was trying to do was to create a sense of anger and inspiration, a sense that if you went through that museum, you should, as John Hope Franklin used to say to me, you should come out changed. I wanted you to come out a little angry, but more importantly, I wanted you to recognize that I was trying to create new generations of activists, new generations who recognize that the struggle to make America be America, to quote Langston Hughes, was really a struggle that has gone on for hundreds of years, and it will be a struggle we will always have. So the notion that we will get to the promised land is a false notion.
Do you worry though, Lonnie, that sometimes putting things in a museum like that and putting them in that kind of setting gives people kind of a way to sort of abdicate their responsibility at some level and say, you know what, this is already done. I see that we're a lot more woke than I thought we were, and things are moving in the right direction. I'm going to go home now and do my thing like I was doing before. Do you
I
get
think
concerned about sort of boxing things like that?
You know, I thought a lot about it, which is why the museum came close to the present, right? It wasn't about yesterday, it was about today.
Yeah.
So I wanted people to see Black Lives Matter. I wanted people to understand about Freddie Gray. You know, I wanted to use programs to say, you can't understand who this country is without understanding what happened to Freddie Gray in Baltimore, what happened to Trayvon Martin. So that for me, this was an opportunity to say, here's what history does. It's not a way to say it's over, it's a grounding, it's a foundation that you can then take and shape to where you want to go. I just think that anybody who believes that Blackness, that there will be complete fairness in America is unbelievably naive.
Mhm.
But what they should believe is through protests, through struggle, through loss, America can be incrementally moved to a way that is fair. But I think that anybody who comes into that museum and says, we've made it, didn't look at what we saw.
So, Aoife, I want to talk about the audiences that come to see the play. What what type of folks come to see a play like this, and what have you seen? Some of the transformations that have come about from people having come to see the play and talking to you afterwards.
Well, now that it's 3 plays, they're kind of different experiences. Starting out with the first one, The Ballad of Emmett Till, that has had most productions, numerous productions since its premiere at the Goodman in 2008. It's almost like it's a striated response in the same way our society is. White audiences, that audience members, the frequent response is one of just the kind of an intake of breath, an intake of a recognition of our humanity, and taking on a sense of responsibility for the history without, personalizing it into that. Well, that I'm not personally a racist, which you often get when you're trying to do stories that are legitimate stories of the American experience. So in creating the fullness of human characters that I have in this whole, what is now a panoply that goes from Emmett's story to the story of the trial to the story of the aftermath in the Delta. The texture of the human beings creates for white audiences a palpable recognition of the humanity of Black people, and also recognition that they maybe didn't have that real sense before. And so it's there, they come out kind of wide-eyed, like, wow, with an understanding of what our struggle has been to be recognized as equally human. Forget about the rights part, but that we are of the same species, and we are of the same musculature and blood and organs and spirit, and that there's it's an aha moment for a lot of white audience members in that way. For young Black people, as I said, it is a recognition of this continuum of history, that this has been an ongoing struggle, that what they're dealing with right now in terms of the carceral state and the imprisonment of our communities within this structure, they are seeing that this is a continuation from our history and the legacy of our enslavement, and they come out more knowledgeable, and they come out more determined to find their own ways of grappling with this in our time. For people of my generation who are children of the civil rights movement and came up, with the story of Emmett Till as that cautionary tale, it is again an acknowledgement of people being able to give voice to their own personal struggle and personal pain. We were often sent out as foot soldiers, uninformed of what our role was, especially if we were, the guinea pigs of desegregation, or that we are able to see our own struggle and acknowledge that pain, and also acknowledge the achievements, as Lonnie was saying, the small steps of achievement that have come out of that continual struggle.
So
I would argue that one of the strengths of art is that it makes stories universal. So that the African American experience is the experience of us all. That it's not the story of one community. It's a story that says, here's the lens to understand America. Is the most powerful part of art. That it can be particular, it can be driven by a culture, but anybody who comes to that sees the reflection of themselves, sees a reflection through their lens, and by looking at art, you, in some ways, rather than divide, you bring us together by helping us find the universal.
Now back to you, Eva. When you were writing the play, did you have a specific audience in mind? Were you writing it for white people? Were you writing it for Black folks? Were you what were you? Who was your audience that you were thinking that needs to see and hear this? Because
I tend to
I wanted to add one more thing.
Yes.
The analysis you made about white folks coming in and feeling that sense of humanity and stuff is a really low bar, I have to say. For people to recognize that we're human, we're in the same species, who knew that? It feels a little bit of a really basic low bar that you're beginning with. Are you making the assumption that that's where you need to start in order for it to create the change that has to happen? Because it's like when people saw like 12 years a slave, they thought, I had no idea slavery was so bad. Who knew? But
right.
I mean, it seems odd that people are just discovering the struggles and the pain that marginalized people and people of color and Black people specifically in this country have endured.
It's tragic. It's not odd to me. It's going on right now when we are hearing the reports of the disproportionate mortality of Black people, and the reasons described are lack of access or poverty, or that seeing these systemic things without them having any relation to purpose or intent or actions on the part of individual human beings. It looks like it's this systemic condition, like slavery seemed like a systemic condition versus enslavement, which is the word I prefer, that has some actionable sense around it. These are things that are being done. They are actions that have results, as opposed to looking at simply the results. And so, yes, it's a lot. Yeah, and again, there's an intellectual understanding of humanity and but there's also a visceral and gut understanding of our commonality that I think uh, 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 drama and poetry and perhaps that can get to either the immediacy of a moment, the immediacy of of um, Emmett Till's death did that in its time, which is why suddenly white media became enthralled in the story. It was that awakening moment of the recognition of this of the humanity that had been so brutally stolen from this child. And so in the ritual recreation of the that part of the story, I am trying to create a simulation of that sensation because fundamentally there is this disconnect that allows uh, um, uh, errant police not to see a human being, but to see uh, uh, an object upon which they can act with impunity, and that they can attack with impunity. Uh, and so when you, I don't think it's a low bar. It's a recognition of, yes, where one of the things we have to start now, concomitant with that is the spirit of resistance. Like, I don't need you to recognize me, but my humanity, but that's why I need to put these laws and these processes in place so that it can be protected. But what I try to do is as an artist is to break through and to create that sense of our universal uh, um, our universal reality, and to recruit um, uh, more people to the efforts of liberation.
Well, art has become used as a kind of a almost in this country and in many forms as a way of sort of truth and reconciliation kind of forum. But that requires another sort of a recognition on both sides. It requires some sort of coming to terms with issues that this country's been grappling with for a long time. We have not gone through a truth and reconciliation state here in this country. We tend to try to skip over the idea of what happened in the past and say, let's move on from day one, being today, and let's move forward without having to look at the past, which the past is so significant for us to be able to move forward. Let me ask you, what do you feel is the way forward as a society for us? And I want to spend the last few minutes speaking about that. What is the role of art in that movement forward? And do you feel, and I know unfortunately, we didn't have Representative Sheila Jackson Lee, but I want to talk about reparations also as a way to move this whole thing forward, because it's one thing to talk about arts, one thing to recognize, one thing to say, yes, we believe in our shared humanity. It's another thing to say, okay, now what do we do about it? How are we going to fix the wrongs that have happened? Because you can't move on without some kind of reparation at some level. And so I want to speak about that. I don't know who wants to start with that. Maybe we can start with Lonnie.
Well, I think that, first of all, I would sort of argue what is so important about the National Museum of African American History and Culture is that right in the center of Washington, at the mall where you come to learn what it means to be an American, suddenly all those stories that were left out of the narrative are now there. And what's important about the Smithsonian is that the Smithsonian is a place where everybody will come and wrestle with stories that they wouldn't do in their hometown because they're coming to do the Smithsonian. So suddenly you have, 10 million people that have gone through the African American Museum, and by definition are changed. I think what's important is to recognize that I believe very strongly that so much of my work was shaped by South Africa. I spent a lot of time in South Africa, and we are not near the healing point at all, and we're not even close to reconciliation. With places like the African American Museum, cultural presentations allow us at least to get to shine the light on the past and to recognize that the past is essential to who we are today. And that I believe strongly that this country needs to really grapple with its true identity. And its true identity is not the good guys in the white hats. It is not the place that simply saves the world. It is a place that has caused pain, caused death, has built its community, it built its economy on the backs of people that didn't share the benefits of that. And so I think that part of the key of art and culture is when I go to the theater, when I look at art, I see so many stories that people need to understand that may be buried in museums, but culture brings it out. And to me, that's why I think that one of the things I love the most is when artists and writers come through the museum and go away inspired to fight the good fight.
Yeah.
Aoife.
Well, I look at, I like to think less about reparations than reconstruction. Because I don't, if you're talking about reparations in terms of repair, I think we need to kind of dismantle and construct what it is we are looking to do, and using the models of history to do that. The understanding of our struggle from 1619 until today, that this has been an ongoing, from the fundamental founding, pre-founding of this American experiment, we have been central to that in both the use of our, the abuse of our labor, our life imprisoned labor under enslavement, and the perpetuation of that throughout the 20th century into today, when we're seeing these dramatic disparities in the health and welfare of Black people. And so what art can do is to show these pathways of historic characters and historic movements, and also, artists who deal with the contemporary lens, looking very squarely at where we are, and bringing those what are statistics and kind of the objective narrative of history, making it subjective so that people can internalize it emotionally, and then come up with new strategies, new mechanisms, as individuals and as a people for addressing it. And we do need to consider how, as a nation, we will come to grips with this history. It's we're still in a situation where our particular history is not visible enough, but it's also undermined by this narrative history that still is endorsing Confederate statues. It's still making the Old South, the slaveocracy, a society of nobility. And so there's much work to do. It's happening on in every realm of the arts, from some brilliant novels of Ta-Nehisi Coates, The Water Dancer, and Colson Whitehead's The Underground Railroad, Toni Morrison's brilliant books. It's happening in poetry with Kevin Young's work, and it's happening in theater. At the same time, this is what we can do kind of at the fulcrum, but we have to figure out ways where this will begin to permeate our society more. So I'm still working this. It may be a blessing in disguise that we're having to figure out how to make theater more digitized, if you will, how to get these wonderful treatises that are out there to a greater number of people so we can get a critical mass that's ready to strategize about how we go forward.
Sheldon.
Yeah, I think that the marriage of history and art is very critical in any kind of change. My work in particular is focused on restorative histories as a way to set the framework for people who are focused on reparations. I believe if we tell the story of African Americans in this country in a truthful way, it sets the frame up for a whole different processing. And I think that, we are definitely struggling with the impact of revisionist histories. And I think if we look at what happened historically, the first thing that the Daughters of Confederacy did after the end of the Confederate War is target early childhood learning books. And they went to the schools and they petitioned to reposition their story, which impacts we're still dealing with today. But I definitely say that kind of work right now is really critical. And the work that Aoife is doing really does offer something that we can't deal with in a hyper contemporary sense, in the fact that what her work does is allow us to build a relationship with the narrative arc, or the arc of justice, of a sense. We get to see the relationship of justice and how that transpires over time with Emmett Till. We don't necessarily get to see that with Trayvon Martin. We don't necessarily get to see that with Freddie Gray, because we're still in it right now. And sometimes it's very difficult for us as a society to deal with the hyper contemporary. But what we can do is find some aspirational notes that come out of the, 50 plus years that we've been dealing with Emmett's narrative. And we see how the story changed, and we see how Emmett then becomes a arbiter of justice in ways that his contemporaries didn't get to see, in the ways that we won't be able to see. So that's why these types of works are critical, because we get to build a relationship with justice that we normally don't get to build in this sense. There's still too much for us to deal with the loss and then the compounded loss when it comes to the system of justice in our relationships. Here we get to see something a little bit more hopeful. So I'm hoping that that type of work continues to be important and produced and supported, so that we can see what we need to do in respects to reparations, before we start that process.
I think there. Okay.
Go ahead, Mark, please. No.
I was just going to say that the bottom line is that the South lost the Civil War, but they won the peace.
Yes, sir.
And we are wrestling with that to this day. And that, for me, reparations is not about giving me a check. For me, reparations is really threefold. If you could put money to make sure Black kids get educated, because for many of us, we got in under a window that is now closed. And I worry about that. I also think that we've got to, this day reminds us how important health disparities are. So if I'd rather see money going into helping Howard University Hospital do more reaching out and working with communities. And then I think the third piece for me that reparations is essential about, which is supporting the arts, because what the arts do is make people believe in the possible. The biggest challenge is for many people is to say, it's always been this way, it's horrible, it's never going to change. And art lets us go beyond that and helps us dream, helps us realize, it challenges us to be better. I'd rather see money going to support that than giving me a.
I think we have Representative Sheila Jackson Lee. Are you there, Representative?
I am. Good morning.
Thank you
I
so
am
much
here.
for being with us. And your coming on is very, very timely because we started talking about reparations. And I know that HR 40 has been at the forefront of your agenda. And I want to talk to you. We talked about the impact of art on moving this conversation forward on civil rights and human rights and equity in this country. Can you speak a little bit about where we are today with this issue of reparations and idea of a truth and reconciliation as part of the American experience that we have not had? Can you speak a little bit about that?
Well, first of all, good morning to everyone. And obviously, you were so much a part of my psychic. I've done everything to be able to join you. I did not want this moment to um, be, if will, uh, lacking in my participation. So, to all of you, thank you very much for your astuteness. And it is timely. I've listened to some of the discussion. So, let me just say, that in the early 1900s, Congressman White was the last congressperson of African American heritage to be standing in the United States Congress, written out by Jim Crowism and the failure of Reconstruction. And his final words to the floor in the House of Representatives was, "The Negro will rise like the phoenix." Through the 20th century, we had mountains and more valleys in our life, and the successes or the lack of success of Negroes and colored people in the 1920s, from depression and wars, and certainly the horrors of racism and segregation. Emmett Till, of course, in life rose like the phoenix because of a powerful mother, a powerful woman who refused to allow his young life to be extinguished because of the cruelty and brutality of ugly men who refused to accept his humanity. I am reminded of that picture in Jet Magazine. And so, what I would suggest as we speak about his life, and as you have already probably spoken about the value of SNCC, and as I reflect on that, I think of the women, Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, and then my colleague, the Honorable John Lewis and Julian Bond, names that we remember, but also statements that they made. I would make the very strong argument that we need to have a broader view of what reparations and HR 40 actually is. I'm a legislator, and so I take facts. I recount history as I can, which is the historical perspective of slaves starting 1619. Many will note that there were other entries of Africans other than 1619, but the idea of slavery as a historical moment in our life of being in this country, and the uh, unspeakable brutality that slavery was, and then the failure of Reconstruction. My task is to do what all of you have noted, and to do it in a way that allows the freedom for us to be able to respond to the question of repair in our own ways. I beg of you in your advocacy to not interpret and reinterpret reparations in such a way that you cannot draw upon the psychic of African Americans and other people of color and others in the United States to say, yes, that's the right thing to do. Let's pass HR 40 reparations, never to have been done before, never to have had a significant hearing as we did just recently, never to have promised another hearing, and never to have leadership in the United States Congress to say that we plan to put this on the floor of the House and actually have a vote. Um, Secretary, you knew how we managed to work with you to create a miracle which no one ever thought we could create, and that is the Smithsonian, the African American Museum of Culture and History. No one ever thought that was not even a dream. And here we are with a magnificent edifice to the likes of Emmett Till and many others, as we have risen like the phoenix. Look at the reparations bill in the same way, which, if this legislation is passed, it can be repair, it can be reconstruction, it can be the issues of promoting and highlighting education so that in the middle of COVID-19, we don't have African-American schools, at-risk schools, struggling to do online teaching because the students don't have the equipment in 2020, or that health disparities have emphasized the fact that COVID-19 is disproportionately impacting African Americans and African American males. And of course, the question of supporting the arts and the history of our people. HR 40 is all of that, all of that. And then it's my task as a legislator to pass a document that, as my wonderful moderator said, also drives us to reconciliation and truth. That is what the legislation says. It does put it in the context of an apology, but what it says is that the commission can design how that repair will take place. And I, for one, having studied the Reconciliation and Truth Commission in South Africa, having gone to the Universal Conference in South Africa, probably the first that we've had on racism, representing the United States, insisting that the United States send a delegation at that time when they were not going to send a delegation. So members of the Congressional Black Caucus insisted, and we went as a delegation to speak to the question of international racism. This bill is in the context of Congressman White suggesting that the Negro, in spite of him being thrown out of Congress because of the ugliness of redistricting and racism, that the Negro would rise as like the phoenix, and the brutality of Emmett Till's death, but then the phoenix-likeness of his life and his story. And we have these moments in history. All is captured, I believe, in the ultimate passage of a reparations bill that gives to all of us a voice in our own space to be able to speak to our plight in this country and the international question of racism impacting the Caribbean and the continent and Europe in a way that we've never been able to speak to it again. The United States affirmatively would acknowledge the fact that the brutality of 250 years of unpaid labor and brutality and death deserves an acknowledgement far beyond what we've ever been able to do. And so I argue vigorously that voices of intellect like all of you, the secretary who led the Smithsonian Museum, led us to a point of its construction and its opening and its absolute space of honor and royalty in the history of the United States. None of us need to extinguish or need to suggest that a Congress passing HR 40 and the signature of a president on a bill like that is limiting. It is not limiting. It is actually inspiring. It is actually lifting, and it's freeing because we need to be able to use it in the way that we can with all of our voices. So forgive me for my passion, but I just believe that among the many things that you've discussed this morning that I apologize was not able to hear all of the brilliance, but I heard so much that was inspirational to me. It inspires me and my colleagues even more that HR 40 is part of the discussion, not all of the discussion, but it can be an effective tool that all of us can use to be able to do, as we have spoken about this morning, and to tell the story that we need to tell and to heal us and to find the tools to do that.
Thank you. We love your passion. Thank you for keeping it up. I wanted to just end this conversation by going around, maybe starting with you, Sheldon. What inspires you? Today, we're living in a world of a lot of unknowns. There's, the COVID-19 thing has isolated people at some level. It's connected people at another level. But what inspires you? What keeps you going in light of what we're talking about here today?
The curiosity of children is the most inspiring thing, I think, for me now. There's hope in their eyes and hopes in their actions. And it's the kind of hope that convicts me to do the best that I can before I leave this space to make sure that they can access and maintain that curiosity and that innocence for as long as possible.
Aoife?
For me, I continue to be inspired by the remarkable history of our people, and on so many tiers in every aspect of our experience here, be it our struggle for liberation during enslavement, during Jim Crow, during the Civil Rights era, during the present era, our uh, uh, tendency and our activism to get us into positions of legislative authority, like Congresswoman Jackson Lee's, and our activism and urgency and struggle, whether it be in the artistic realm, whether it be in the economic realm, or working through the legislature. On all of these tiers, it's the joint action and the combined ingenuity and commitment that has propelled us forward. As I said earlier, Emmett's story may not have surfaced in the same way had not Brown versus the Board of Ed been at the center of had stirred up the hornet's nest of white supremacist reaction just in the year and months before his trip to Mississippi. It was the combination of actions that has been such a remarkable saga of the struggle for justice, for truth, and for equality. Our abundant compassion and our amazing resilience and the waves and waves of creativity that have come out of that experience on every platform of our lives, down to the menus in your restaurant. We have been a source of elevating humanity, and that inspires me daily to see how do I get this. How do I not only get the story out, but how do I get the imprint of that commitment into the hearts of more human beings?
I once asked Howard Zinn, I said, what makes you hopeful? He's of course, the late great historian, Howard Zinn. He said something like, to be hopeful in bad times is not just foolishly romantic. It is based on the fact that human history is a history full of cruelty, but also a history full of compassion, of courage, of kindness. And those words have always stayed with me. And you echoed some of those words in your statement, Aoife. Thank you so much. Lonnie.
I am inspired by the history of African American women. I have a picture that always stays with me. I'm looking at it now, of an enslaved woman who is carrying a hoe that is taller than she is. She is struggling with a heavy basket. She's got a dress that's tattered. Her knuckles are swollen from work, but her head is up and she's leaning forward and she's stepping ahead. For me, Black women have believed in a country that didn't believe in them. They believed in families when families were trying to be threatened and destroyed. So every time I need inspiration, I look at the history of Black women and think how fortunate this country is to have strong Black women, many of whose names we'll never know, but whose humor, whose humanities, whose love made us the country we are today.
And I'll give you the last word, Congresswoman. You're the Congresswoman, 18th District of Texas, with the great city of Houston. I wanted to give you the last word. What inspires you in light of what we're seeing today? Some of the brutality that's happening still for young Black boys and men and women, of course, and now in the midst of this COVID-19 situation. What inspires you?
Well, first, thank you so very much for giving me the privilege and the honor of being with such visionaries. And certainly the words that I've just heard will propel me as we're in the midst of trying to spread testing and to fight against wrong policies that are really impacting our community in a way that, as I said, disproportionately impacts us during COVID-19. But I take my inspiration from some of the words that have just been said here, but I'll combine it by saying I take my inspiration from the survival mode that African Americans through our history have always played out. And in the midst of that survival are children. I chair the Congressional Children's Caucus, but if you go amongst the children of our community, starting with their early ages, I spend time in our schools to see these children who come from such severely disparate economic backgrounds still be the light of our life in their song, in their words, in their energy, in their willingness to accept and to overcome. And it had to be children throughout our history that propelled us to be able to survive. Children obviously grew up to be teenagers and grown-ups, but we are reminded of Emmett Till, 14 years old, the confidence that he had, the um, uh, unexpectedness, if you will. He didn't expect to be treated like this. Why shouldn't he be treated like any other young boy that was 14, or the children who put themselves on the front lines for the civil rights movement, or those who were in SNCC? They were young people, and willingness to sit and suffer the disastrous treatment that they got at lunch tables for us, if you will. They sat there for us. We sat there for us. Black Lives Matter, the Black Power movement that many of us managed to be standing somewhere with our fists in the air. It's our children who have said to all of us, and continue to stay as we say as we stand alongside of them, that we will not be denied, we will not be deprived, and we ask you the question of whether you'll stand with us and fight for us. So the children who come out of the history of this brutality of slavery and still carry the beautiful banner, the color of our skin, and the history of our tradition, and still are outstanding scholars, um, now standing in line to be drafted by the NFL, but yet, as we have noted, can also experience the cruelty of foster care, the cruelty of inadequate parenting, the cruelty of juvenile detention, or schools that are not up to the speed of their intellect. And yet, these children, these children carry the history of that African woman, that African slave woman. They carry the history of Sojourner Truth. They carry the history of Dr. Martin Luther King, Coretta Scott King, Shirley Chisholm. They carry the history of Barbara Jordan, and they can walk and step and design and create and make music and do so many things that we are just marveled at. I salute them as history bearers, history carriers, and they inspire me all the time. And I try to spend as much time fighting for them as we possibly can. So I thank you so very much for giving me the opportunity for joining you. But I pray for our children, their spirit, and of course, the history that they carry, that it gives them the greater life and strength to carry on.
Well, thank you, Sheldon Scott, artist and cultural director for the Eaton Hotel. Thank you, Eva Bayeza, for the Emmett Till Trilogy. Thank you so much for being with us. And thank you, Lonnie Bunch, 14th Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution and founding director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Thank you for being with us. And thank you very much, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. I know it's a very busy time for you. We appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. And on behalf of Mosaic Alive, thank you all for watching, and we look forward to seeing you in real life, where theaters are supposed to be. You're supposed to be in Denver. You'll wait till we start gathering again. Take care.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank
you,
you.
Mr. Secretary.
Thank you all very much.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you.